Helena, Montana Territory. January 1889, a widowed carpenter stepped into Bellamy's mercantile with a 7-month-old girl under his coat and a dented blue tin in his hand. He had come to return the child's food, not because she no longer needed it, because the room where they slept had no coal left. The wind shoved the door closed behind Caleb Hart and sent a thin ribbon of snow across the floorboards. Every face in the store turned toward him, then quickly turned away. Caleb's coat had been patched at both elbows. One boot was split near the heel. His right hand was wrapped in linen where a bridge spike had torn the palm weeks earlier, but the baby against his chest was wrapped carefully, too carefully, as if every fold of the faded blanket had been placed there to keep the whole world from touching her. Near the back wall stood Adelaide Wren, widow of a freight baron and owner of one of the largest ranches north of Helena. At 43, she controlled wagon contracts, grazing land, and a block of railroad stock that made bankers smile before she had spoken a word. She had also lived alone for 17 years. Her daughter Miriam had died before her 5th birthday. Since then, Adelaide had learned to move through rooms without expecting warmth from them. Then she heard the baby make a small, dry sound. Not a cry, the sound a child makes when she has already cried too long. Caleb walked to the counter and set down the blue tin. The shopkeeper, Otis Bellamy, kept writing in his ledger. "What is it this time, Hart?" Caleb swallowed. "I need you to take this back." Otis looked at the tin, then at the child. "You bought it on account 4 days ago." "I know, and now you want the money." "Not money, coal, a small sack, or lamp oil." Otis leaned back. "That tin has been carried through half the territory. The label is torn and the lid is bent. The seal is unbroken. That does not make it new." Caleb's jaw tightened. He kept his voice low. "The bridge company let 11 men go yesterday. I was one of them." A murmur moved through the store. Everyone knew about the accident at Prickly Pear Creek. A temporary trestle had failed. 2 workers had been crushed beneath green timber, and Caleb had told the foreman the bracing was wrong before the collapse. The company called him troublesome. The other men called him honest. Otis tapped the ledger with one finger. "You still owe for the tin. I will pay it." "With what?" Caleb looked at the baby under his coat. "With work when my hand closes again." Otis gave a short laugh. "Promises do not heat my store." Caleb's wrapped hand curled around the counter edge. "If I keep the food, Rose can eat for a week. If I trade it for coal, she can sleep without ice forming inside the window." His voice broke on the last word. He lowered his head. "I cannot give her both." No one spoke. A rancher studied a display of harness buckles. A woman near the flour barrels adjusted her gloves. 2 clerks suddenly found reasons to disappear into the stockroom. Adelaide watched Caleb's injured hand tremble. Then she watched him steady it against the baby's back. That was what moved her, not his poverty, not his shame. The way tenderness survived inside a man who looked as though life had beaten everything else out of him. Otis pushed the tin back. No returns. Rose began to cry. The sound was thin, breathless, and frightened. Adelaide crossed the aisle. Her black wool skirt brushed the crates, and the silver clasp at her throat caught the stove light. "Mr. Bellamy." Otis stood straighter at once. "Mrs. Wren, I did not see you there." "I noticed." She placed a banknote on the counter. "Give Mr. Hart the tin, 20 pounds of coal, a bottle of lamp oil, and a fresh wool blanket." Caleb turned toward her. No, his answer came so fast that even Otis blinked. Adelaide met his eyes. They were gray, exhausted, and far too proud for the room he had entered. "I am not asking you to beg. It amounts to the same thing. No, begging asks for mercy without terms." She looked at the linen around his hand. "I have terms." Caleb said nothing. Adelaide continued. "The freight platform on my north property needs new bracing. The old telegraph lodge beside it has stood empty for 6 years. You are a bridge carpenter." "I was." "Can you still read a load?" "Yes." "Can you tell green pine from seasoned timber? From across a yard?" "Can you work when that hand heals?" Caleb glanced at Rose. "Yes." "Then this is an advance." Otis cleared his throat. "Mrs. Wren, surely you do not mean to place a dismissed agitator on your property." Adelaide turned her head slowly. "I mean to hire the man who warned a company that its bridge would kill people." The store went still. She pushed the blue tin back toward Caleb. "This is not payment for your pride. It is payment for an inspection. Tomorrow you will examine the platform and tell my manager whether it is safe." Caleb looked at the food, the coal ticket, and the woman offering him a way to stand upright. "What if it is unsafe?" "Then you will say so. And if your manager does not like the answer, then he may argue with me." For the first time, something almost alive moved across Caleb's face. Not a smile, the memory of one. He took the tin. Tomorrow, Adelaide nodded. Tomorrow, her carriage carried them beyond the brick storefronts, past the rail spur, and into the poorer edge of Helena, where homes had been made from packing crates, tar paper, and hope stretched too thin. Caleb sat forward on the velvet seat so his wet coat would not touch the upholstery. Rose stopped crying once the carriage warmed. Adelaide studied the child's tiny hand curled around one of Caleb's coat buttons. Her name is Rose, Rosalie Hart, Rose when she is not angry. And her mother, Caleb looked out the window. Emma died in May. Fever after the birth. Adelaide did not offer the soft, useless words people used when they were frightened by grief. She only said, "I am sorry." Caleb nodded once. He told her he had come west building culverts and trestles for the Northern Pacific. He had saved wages for a small workshop of his own. Then Emma became sick. The doctor's fees swallowed the savings. After her death, every job meant leaving Rose with someone he could barely pay. And now the company has marked you as trouble. I marked myself, he said. I should have kept my mouth shut. Would the bridge have stood? No. Then your silence would have cost more than your job. The carriage stopped beside a shack leaning into the wind. The window had been covered with sacking. A stovepipe rose from the roof, but no smoke came from it. Adelaide felt anger before pity. Anger at a town that could build banks from cut stone while a child slept behind flour cloth. Caleb lifted the coal sack with one arm. I will be at your north property by 8. You should let your hand rest. I said I would be there. Adelaide looked at him for a long moment. Yes, she said. You did. That night, she walked through the unused east wing of her house and opened a door that had not moved in years. Miriam's room still smelled faintly of cedar. A red ribbon rested inside a porcelain dish. A small pair of button shoes stood beneath the wardrobe. On the shelf sat a toy wooden bird with one wing missing. Adelaide picked it up. For 17 years she had guarded this room as if grief were a duty. Now another child's cry had entered it. No one replaces you, she whispered. The words steadied her. Helping Rose was not betrayal. It was proof that Miriam's life had not taught her only how to close a door. The next morning Caleb arrived before 8. He came on foot, carrying Rose in a sling beneath his coat. The north property sat where the freight road crossed a shallow creek. The platform had once served wool wagons and mining supply teams. Now its rails were warped, the loading beams had split, and the telegraph lodge beside it leaned toward the cottonwoods. Adelaide's estate manager, Mr. Pritchard, looked Caleb over with open suspicion. You are late, Caleb pointed toward the yard clock. It is 7:46. Pritchard's mouth tightened. Caleb spent 2 hours measuring spans, probing rot, and studying how the platform had settled. Then he placed a chalk mark on the third support. This beam is carrying weight it was never cut to hold. Pritchard scoffed. It has stood for 20 years. So did the trestle at Prickly Pear Creek. Adelaide watched the two men face each other. What happens if we load spring wool here? She asked. Caleb crouched and pressed his thumb into the damp grain. The center drops, the wagons roll. Someone gets pinned against the siding. How long to repair it, with seasoned timber, and 2 men 3 weeks? Pritchard said. That would cost more than closing the platform. Caleb stood. Closing it costs every small rancher north of the creek an extra 14 miles to market. Adelaide looked from the rotten beam to the road winding toward the distant homesteads. What would you do? Rebuild the center span, raise the drainage, use iron straps at the joints, and stop setting posts in soil that holds spring water. Pritchard folded his arms. Adelaide said, hire 2 men. Caleb stared at her. You have the work, she told him. The lodge comes with it. 1 room is dry, the stove draws, and the roof can be repaired before the next snow. I will pay rent. It is part of the wage, then write it that way. Adelaide almost smiled. I will. Within a week, smoke rose from the lodge chimney. Within 2, the platform had been stripped to its sound timbers. Caleb worked slowly at first. His injured hand could not grip a hammer for long, so he built jigs, tied braces, and used leverage where strength failed him. The 2 laborers assigned to him stopped doubting him after the first wagon crossed the temporary span without a shiver. Adelaide began walking to the north property in the afternoons. At first, she claimed she was inspecting progress. Then she stopped making excuses. She brought account books and sat near the stove while Rose slept in a cradle Caleb had built from an old packing crate. He had planed the board smooth and carved tiny wings along the rails. One day, Adelaide found him sanding the broken toy bird from Miriam's room. She froze in the doorway. "I did not give you that." "No," Caleb said. "It was on the table in the East Hall. One wing was gone." He held up a new piece of cedar, shaped to match the old one. "I thought it might be worth mending." Adelaide's throat tightened. "That belonged to my daughter." Caleb set down the knife. "I am sorry. I should have asked." She touched the worn paint on the bird's back. Miriam carried it everywhere. Then it was worth mending. He fitted the new wing into place. The repaired wood did not match the old wood. It was lighter, cleaner, impossible to mistake for the original. Adelaide turned the bird in her hands. "You did not try to hide the break." "A hidden repair is usually a weak one," Caleb said. "Better to make the joint honest." The words stayed with her. "A hidden repair is usually a weak one." For years, Adelaide had pretended that wealth had repaired her. It had only hidden the break. By February, Caleb's wages were current, the lodge roof was sound, and the loading platform could hold twice its former weight. He returned every extra nail to the supply shed. When Pritchard miscounted his pay by $2, Caleb walked through sleet to correct it. He asked for no favors. He did ask for books, engineering manuals, agricultural bulletins. Anything on timber seasoning, truss design, or water flow. "You read all of these?" Adelaide asked. "At night, after working 10 hours? Rose wakes every 3. Reading fills the spaces." Adelaide looked at the sleeping child. "So does loneliness." Caleb met her eyes. Neither of them looked away. Then Helena began to talk. At the boarding houses, people said Adelaide Wren had installed a handsome drifter on her land. At the ladies' tea circle, they said grief had finally softened her mind. At the bank, they said Caleb Hart was organizing laborers. The last rumor reached a man named Silas Rourke. Rourke owned the bridge company that had dismissed Caleb. He also sat on the board of the territorial bank that financed Adelaide's freight contracts. He had wanted the north property for years, because the railroad intended to survey a spur across it. He arrived at Adelaide's house in a black sleigh with 2 attorneys. Rourke was broad, polished, and calm in the way of men accustomed to having threats delivered by someone else. "Mrs. Wren," he said, removing his gloves, "you have made an unfortunate hire." "I have made an excellent hire." He encouraged men to refuse work. He warned them that your trestle was unsafe. There was no official finding. 2 men were buried under it. Rourke's smile thinned. "You are extending shelter to a man who damages confidence in legitimate enterprise." Adelaide poured no tea. "What do you want?" "The north property." There it was. He placed a folded document on the table. "Your late husband's freight company owes renewal fees on 3 banknotes. We can extend them if you sell the creek parcel. And if I do not, the notes come due in 30 days. Your spring freight contracts may also be reviewed." Adelaide knew the numbers. The ranch was rich in land and poor in ready cash. If the bank called the notes before wool season, she would have to sell railroad stock at a loss. If the freight contracts vanished, 32 families would lose work. Rourke leaned closer. "This is not about one carpenter. It is about judgment." "No," Adelaide said. "It is about leverage." His eyes cooled. "Send Hart away, sell the land, and the problem disappears." Adelaide thought of the blue tin. She thought of Rose sleeping in a crate cradle beneath a roof Caleb had repaired himself. Then she thought of 32 families. For the first time since entering Bellamy's store, mercy no longer felt simple. That evening she told Caleb everything. He stood beside the lodge stove, his face unreadable. "You should sell." Adelaide looked up sharply. "You agree with him?" "I agree that 32 families should not lose wages because I cannot keep quiet." "And what happens to you?" "I leave. To where? Bozeman, Butte, somewhere they do not know my name." "With Rose in February, I have done worse. That does not make it acceptable." Caleb's voice hardened. "You gave me work. I will not repay you by taking your company down with me." Adelaide rose. "You think this is still about rescuing you, isn't it?" "No." She crossed the room and laid Miriam's repaired bird on the table between them. "This is about whether a broken thing must pretend it was never broken to deserve a place in the world." Caleb looked at the cedar wing. Adelaide's voice softened. "You did not make the old wood disappear. You gave it away to carry weight again." He closed his eyes. When he opened them, the anger had gone, leaving only fear. "Rourke can ruin you. He can cost me money. He can cost you your name. My name has kept me invited to rooms I despise." Caleb looked toward Rose. "What are you going to do?" Adelaide touched the repaired bird. "Make the joint honest." The following Monday, Adelaide called a meeting at the North Freight platform. Not at the courthouse, not at the bank, at the place Caleb had rebuilt. Ranchers came in wool coats, teamsters came with frozen beards. Washerwomen stood beside clerks. The 11 men dismissed from the bridge crew arrived together. Rourke came too. He expected surrender. Adelaide stepped onto the platform and held up a set of recorded papers. "This property will not be sold." A murmur rolled through the crowd. "I have transferred the creek parcel, the telegraph lodge, and the loading yard into a worker trust." Rourke's face changed. Adelaide continued. "The trust will lease workshop space to carpenters, wheelwrights, teamsters, and widowed mothers who need paid piecework. The platform will remain open to small ranchers at cost. No bank director may seize it to punish one employee." Rourke pushed forward. "You cannot protect your freight company by giving away its assets." "I am not giving them away." She looked toward Caleb. "I am placing them where men like you cannot use them as a collar." The crowd went silent. She read the next clause. "Caleb Hart will serve as foreman for 1 year. If the yard meets its safety and revenue requirements, the trust will grant him a permanent workshop lease for $1 a year." Caleb's expression tightened. He had not known about the clause. Adelaide saw the protest forming. She spoke before he could. "The lease is not a gift. It depends on work, accounts, safety inspections, and the approval of the trustees." One of the dismissed bridge men raised his cap. Another began to clap. Then the ranchers joined. Rourke did not. He lifted his voice above them. "And your banknotes?" Adelaide faced him. "I sold half my railroad shares this morning." That answer cost her more than anyone there understood. The shares had been her late husband's pride. They were also her strongest shield. Rourke smiled again. "You have traded security for sentiment." "No," Adelaide said. "I traded paper control for something that can still stand when papermen panic." She stamped one boot against the platform Caleb had rebuilt. The sound carried through the cold, solid. The crowd heard it, so did Rourke. Within a week, the bank canceled her line of credit. 2 freight clients defected to Rourke's company. The Ladies' Circle removed Adelaide from its winter charity committee. Anonymous letters accused her of disgracing her husband's name. She read every one. Then she fed them to the stove. But courage did not make the arithmetic disappear. For 3 months, Adelaide cut household staff, sold silver, and moved her office into the North Lodge so she could watch every dollar. Caleb opened the workshop and hired 4 of the dismissed bridge men. They repaired wagons, built stock gates, and reinforced culverts for ranchers who paid after market day. The work was hard. The books were thin, and slowly the yard began to live. One evening, Caleb handed Adelaide a small object wrapped in cloth. Inside was a wooden swallow carved from the same cedar he had used to repair Miriam's toy. "Swallows come back," he said, "to the same nest, to the place that becomes home." Adelaide ran her thumb over the wings. "What if the place is gone? Then they build again." Caleb's fingers brushed hers. Neither of them moved away. Rose, now nearly a year old, laughed from the cradle. The sound filled the lodge. Adelaide realized she was no longer visiting the North property because it needed inspection. She came because someone waited for her there. That realization frightened her more than Rourke ever had. Money could be lost and counted. Love could be lost and leave no number behind. Then the weather changed. In early March, a warm Chinook rolled over the mountains. Snow vanished from the roofs in a single afternoon. Water raced through frozen ditches. The creek swelled beneath a lid of rotten ice. Caleb inspected the banks at dusk. "The ice is holding too much water," he told Adelaide. "If it breaks upstream, it will hit the yard before midnight." They moved tools to the platform, tied wagons to cottonwoods, and carried ledgers into the upper room of the lodge. Rose was feverish from teething. Adelaide kept her inside while Caleb and the men worked along the bank. At 10 o'clock, the sound came. A deep fracture rolled through the dark, then another. Caleb looked upstream. "Move!" The ice jam broke. Black water and slabs of white ice tore around the bend, ripped through the lower fence, and slammed into the footbridge. The bridge twisted once and vanished. The first wall of water struck the workshop. Men ran for the loading platform. Adelaide lifted Rose from the cradle. The lodge floor shuddered. A floating beam crashed through the front door and knocked the stove sideways. Coals scattered across the planks. Caleb fought through knee-deep water to reach them. "Upstairs!" Adelaide held Rose against her chest and climbed the narrow ladder. Caleb kicked the coals into the flood before the wall could catch. Another impact struck the lodge. The building tore away from one corner of its foundation. From the upper window, Adelaide saw the roof of the workshop collapse. The trust yard they had built was disappearing piece by piece. Caleb tied a rope around the chimney brace and threw the other end toward the loading platform. It fell short. One of the bridge men, Daniel Price, crawled along a wagon tongue and caught it on the second throw. They pulled the rope tight between the leaning lodge and the platform. "You go first," Caleb told Adelaide. "With Rose, I will tie you both." The lodge shifted again. Adelaide looked down at the black water turning beneath them. "I cannot." Caleb took her face between his cold hands. "Listen to me." His voice was steady. "The rope does not need you to be fearless. It needs you to hold." He wrapped Rose beneath Adelaide's coat, tied the line around her waist, and secured her wrists over it. "Do not look at the water." "What do I look at?" Me. Adelaide stepped through the window. The wind struck her sideways. The rope sagged under her weight and freezing spray soaked her skirts. Hand over hand, she moved toward the platform, while Caleb fed the safety line behind her. Halfway across, a slab of ice hit the lodge. The chimney brace snapped. The rope dropped. Adelaide plunged to her chest in the flood. Rose screamed beneath her coat. Caleb caught the trailing line with his injured hand. The old wound split open at once. He wrapped the rope around his forearm and braced both boots against the window frame. "Pull," he shouted. The men on the platform hauled. Adelaide felt the current dragging her skirts downstream. She could not feel her legs. Rose's cry became muffled under the water and cloth. Then the line tightened. Daniel reached over the platform edge and seized Adelaide's wrist. The men dragged her up. Rose was blue around the lips, but breathing. Adelaide tore open her coat and held the child against her bare skin beneath the wool. "Caleb." The lodge lurched. Caleb tried to cross the sagging rope, but the floor collapsed beneath him. He disappeared into the black water. Adelaide did not think. She shoved Rose into Daniel's arms, looped the safety line around her body, and went over the edge. "Mrs. Wren!" She kicked against the current and found Caleb's coat beneath a sheet of broken ice. His injured hand had tangled in the rope. Adelaide plunged both arms into the water and pulled until her shoulders burned. Caleb's face broke the surface. He was not breathing. The men hauled them toward the platform. On the planks, Adelaide struck his back and pressed both hands against his chest. "Caleb." "Nothing." She pressed again. "Caleb Hart, you do not get to leave after teaching me how to rebuild." Water burst from his mouth. Caleb dragged in a breath that sounded torn from the bottom of the earth. Adelaide bent over him, laughing and crying at once. He opened his eyes. "Rose, alive. You?" Still holding, his bloody hand closed around hers. By dawn, the water began to fall. The lodge was gone. The workshop was wrecked. The platform stood. Its center span had taken the full force of the flood and held. Every iron strap Caleb had insisted on remained in place. The yard was broken. The proof was not. Word spread through Helena before noon. The small ranchers who had used the platform arrived with wagons. The 11 dismissed bridgemen brought tools. Women from the boarding houses brought bread, coffee, dry blankets, and nails collected from old crates. Even Otis Bellamy came carrying a case of infant food. He set it beside Adelaide without meeting her eyes. "No charge," he said. She looked at him. "Put it in the trust ledger." Otis hesitated. Then he nodded. "Yes, Mom. Rourke's bank did not save them. The town did." By spring, 37 families had contributed labor or materials. By summer, the workshop employed 12 men and 6 women doing paid sewing, bookkeeping, and harness work. The trust repaid its emergency notes before the first snow. Rourke's railroad spur was surveyed 2 miles east, over softer ground. It cost him twice what he had offered Adelaide for the creek parcel. Caleb never celebrated that. He was too busy building. He rebuilt the lodge on higher stone piers. He widened the platform drainage. He designed a footbridge with a truss strong enough to survive spring ice. When the bridge was finished, he asked Adelaide to meet him at its center. Rose toddled between them, gripping one finger from each hand. Caleb took the wooden swallow from his pocket. "The first time I carved this," he said, "I thought home was a place a man had to earn before he was allowed to enter." Adelaide looked at the workshop roofs, the worker cottages, and the schoolroom rising beside the yard. "And now? Now I think home is what people build when they stop asking who deserves to be cold." Adelaide's eyes filled. Caleb drew a plain silver ring from his coat. "I have no fortune. You have never once mistaken mine for me. I have a daughter. I know. She has been stealing my breakfast for months." Rose laughed as if she understood. Caleb smiled. "And I love you." Adelaide touched the repaired wooden swallow at her throat. "Then come home." They married beside the new bridge in September of 1889. There were no society ladies from Helena. There were carpenters, ranchers, teamsters, seamstresses, widows, children, and men who had once been told their voices made them unemployable. Otis Bellamy brought a blue tin, not the original one, that had been swept away with the lodge. This tin had been cleaned, painted, and filled with wildflowers. Years passed. The North Yard became a permanent cooperative. In 12 years, it trained more than 40 apprentices, kept the freight road open through 9 hard winters, and helped 23 families move from rented rooms into cottages of their own. Adelaide never recovered all the wealth she had risked. She recovered something larger. Rose grew up crossing the bridge Caleb built. She became the trust's first teacher, then its bookkeeper, then the woman who could look a banker in the eye and explain exactly where every dollar had gone. When Adelaide was old, she kept Miriam's repaired bird beside Caleb's wooden swallow. One carried the mark of what had been lost, the other carried the promise of return, and between them sat a dented blue tin filled with mountain flowers. Some bridges are made from timber and iron. The ones that save a life begin the moment someone refuses to look away.